Alright, so the purpose of this video is twofold. One is the obvious, to deliver you the content about Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And the second is to test whether or not this is a viable way to continue lectures once we're online. Okay, so Sonnet 43 was written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's also called How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways, because that's just the first line of poetry. And it's on page 591 in your book, The Norton Anthology of English Literature, Volume 2. If for some reason you can't find your book, you can always go to thepoetryfoundation.org and read How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways. You can click on this link, or you can just Google poetryfoundation.org, How Do I Love Thee. Honestly, you can probably Google Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Sonnet 43, and you'll find it. There's only one version of Sonnet 43. So what I'm going to ask you to do, okay, there it is. If you click the link, there you go. Okay, resume slideshow. Okay, so make sure that you've either read the poem or listened to the poem. Again, if you go to poetry.org, they have a recording of the poem, and it runs 1 minute and 7 seconds. So if for some reason reading it's just not your cup of tea, or maybe you want to read and listen to it, make sure you've read it. Then pause the video, answer these questions, and post them on Blackboard. So the questions that I want you to answer before watching the rest of the video are these. What are some of the general ideas about love expressed in this poem? How would you characterize the tone of this poem? Go beyond happy or sad. Is she remorseful, or is she celebratory? Is she somber? Is she joyful, fearful, something else? Which words lead you to this conclusion? Does this poem tell you more about the speaker, who is Elizabeth, or the recipient? And that's ostensibly her husband, Robert. We'll talk about that in a second. Again, just, how can you tell based on the wording of the poem? Who do you think it's more about? Or what does it tell you more about? What do you actually know? What is the theme of the poem? And then what you can do is you can pencil down your answers and then revise them as you watch the video. But what I want on Blackboard, at the very least, is your initial answers, and you can tell me how they changed after watching the video, but you don't have to. You can, honestly, there's going to be more questions after the end of the video. Okay, so Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born in 1806, died in 1861. She was 55 years old. She started writing when she was 11 years old. She first published at age 13, and she got sick when at 15 years old. Is when she first got sick, and she was diagnosed with head and spinal pain. For this, she took laudanum, and as you can remember from Coleridge and Kubla Khan, laudanum is an opioid, and it's very addictive, and she was on and off laudanum for the entirety of her life. She was very famous in both the US and the UK, and that's actually how she met her husband. Robert Browning read her poetry and fell in love with it, and she had an overbearing and authoritarian father. She had 10 other siblings, and some of them were sisters and some were brothers, but it didn't matter either way. He forbade all of them from getting married. Nevertheless, like I said, Robert Browning read her poetry, and she was famous before he was. Read her poetry and fell in love with it and wrote her love letters. The poem we're about to look at, the poem you've read already, and the poem we're about to discuss, is part of 44 private sonnets to her husband before getting married. And she wrote them privately for him. They were personal letters, but he loved them so much that he pushed her to publish them. So she published them anonymously, and they're called Sonnets from the Portuguese, and that's for two reasons. One is they pretended that the poems were translated from Portuguese, or by a Portuguese writer, but also Little Portuguesa was a nickname that he had for her. She was a transatlantic celebrated writer. She was a deeply religious person. A quote from her is, "Christ's religion is essentially poetry, poetry glorified." The book said that she was known for her moral and emotional ardor and her energetic engagement with the issues of her day. For example, she campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the West Indies and U.S. In the UK, slavery ended in 1807, but it had not ended yet in the U.S. or the West Indies. Though homebound, Elizabeth Barrett was well educated because she had access to her brother's tutor. Um, Later on, after her death, her poetry was criticized as being of having inappropriate didacticism and rhetorical excess of Victorian poetry. She was married secretly in 1846, and after that, she was disowned by her father. Um, she moved to Italy, which was really good for her health, but later in life, it's suspected that she suffered from tuberculosis, and when she died at age 55, it was from complications of just everything that she'd suffered from up to that point. Her and her husband had a son named Penn. Robert Browning became famous after she was, and we'll look at some of his poetry next. And it is dark and intriguing. Hers is... This slide is a quote from one of Robert's letters to Elizabeth, and I think it captures just how in love he was and his passion he felt before they even lived together. He said in a letter, "I do as I say, love these books with all my heart, and I love you too." Very touching. So let's recall the sonnet form. You'll see that the sonnet 43 has 14 lines, like every sonnet. Sonnets are typically love poems. We've discussed sonnets both last semester when discussing Shakespeare and again just before midterm with Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias. We didn't actually, with Ozymandias, we didn't actually discuss the love aspect of sonnets because it wasn't a love poem, but generally they are. Sonnet 43 is a Petrarchan sonnet, also called an Italian sonnet. Remember that an Italian sonnet is divided into 8 and 6 lines. These are called the octave and the sestet. The octave presents the theme of the poem, and the sestet offers a solution if there is a problem. A sestet provides an answer if there's a question. The octave draws, in this poem, the octave draws analogies between the poet's love and religious and political ideas. So you can see here, the first 8 are the octave. Don't get that confused with the chemistry term octet. And the last 6 are the sestet. So again, you've got the question and the answer. In this poem, the sestet draws analogies between the intensity of love she felt while writing the poem and the intensity of love she experienced earlier in life. Real quick, we're just going to look at all of the alliteration that is present. There's alliteration, and on line 7 we have consonants, which is the repetition of sound within a word. So alliteration is the repetition of the same sound in the beginnings. We have the and thee in lines 1, 2, 5, 9, and 12. The and they in line 8. I'm not going to read all of these off. You can see that quite clearly. And then we have consonants, like I said, in freely and strive on line 7. The first line is, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." It starts with a straightforward question. The tone is possibly replying to a question Robert has asked her. "How do I love thee?" she says. "Let me count the ways." She's happy to explain her love for her husband to her husband. This isn't a sarcastic or contemptuous question and response. This is a very genuine, honest response, where he might have said, "Oh, tell me, Elizabeth, how do you love me?" And she responds, "Well, let me count the ways." So does she count the ways in which she loves him? Is her love discreet and countable? And that's part of what we'll look at in the rest of this video. In your text, it's important to note there's no exclamation point. This is how your text prints it. In some copies, there are versions that have an exclamation point. This further directs us to the conclusion that she was happy or excited, but it also it is one of the few variations of this poem, if you find other sources. Real quick. So she does count the ways, and she counts them 9 times. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet. I love thee freely, I love thee purely. I love thee with the passion put to use. I love thee with a love I seem to lose. I love thee with the breath. I shall love thee better after death. So 9 times she says, I love. The highlighted part, while the first line is pretty straightforward, in lines 2 through 4, we start to see the complexity of the poem. It says, I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight, for the ends of being an ideal grace. So what does that mean? The underlined parts are the parts we're going to focus on. Depth and breadth and height is a spatial metaphor that says, I love every part of you that is physically possible. I love your entire physical existence. It's basically saying her love can be measured. Even though love is ambiguous, she's trying her best to say that in any way that she can measure it, she's going to measure it. When it says soul, being, and grace, we have a motif that repeats, and that motif is a spiritual motif. So in contrast to depth and breadth and height, which is very physical, soul, being, and grace are intangible. So she's saying that she actually loves him in every way that is possible. She has both sides of the binary, the tangible binary and the intangible binary, and she loves him completely. That is her way of saying she loves him completely. And feeling out of sight. I think this is a really interesting metaphor. She says her love reaches these physical and spiritual depths even when she doesn't know what's up ahead. Feeling out of sight is similar to when you learn how to drive. You might remember for driving at night, obviously, you need to have your headlights on, but you were taught to look just beyond the path of your headlights. You have to focus on something you can't see, but prepare for it anyway. Her love is reaching beyond her capability to foresee. She can't see the future, but she knows she's going to love him no matter what comes. Now, remember, she doesn't know what she's getting herself into. She married him. She eloped with him, and when they courted, she was living at home with her entire family, and he could only come and see her and the rest of the family. So she married him without living with him. She married him without having many private moments. So she didn't know what she was getting into, but she's saying that despite this, she will love him, and she knows she's going to love him for whatever comes. If you think about that, that's a very romantic thing to say. It's high romance to say that I'm going to love you completely no matter what. She's definitely continuing the motif through the rest of the poem, where she loves him for better or for worse. She loves him in the best moments and in the worst moments. And we'll see that again through each set of lines. The next part. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. Lines 5 through 6 are talking about how she's going to love him in very humble and domestic ways. She's moved from the spiritual and abstract of her love to the basic necessities of love. She, at this point in her life, was internationally known, but she's saying here that she is humble enough to go through the daily paces with Robert. Her love isn't just the over-the-top romantic gestures, love letters, and eloping. It's the day-to-day getting up together, making the bed, having breakfast, paying the bills, sickness and health kind of love. She also when it says by sun and by candlelight, this is literally kind of a literal thing. By sun is first thing in the morning, I will love you, and I will love you all the way till the evening when we see each other by candlelight. But it is sort of a metaphor for the sun is the vibrancy of youth, and the candle is the still burning love that she will have in her old age. Both of these, it's interesting to note, is these are both forms of light that generate their own light, as opposed to if you had a sun and a moon is just a reflection of the sun, but a candlelight is producing its own light through combustion. In lines 7 through 8, she says, I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. So we're looking at the words right and praise. Right meaning righteous, one who is holy in heart, or also the morally right thing to do. She's using both. So it's morally right, but she's also going back to that religious motif. Praise is praise. It's part of the religious motif again, magnify and glorify, freely, free will, the ability to make choices without prejudice, and then we have purely, pure, free from guilt or sin. So again, just note that she has both the literal meaning and the religious meaning. Why did it do that? Okay. Let me start over. Okay. So in lines 7 through 8, she's saying, I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. We have freely, which this has both the literal meaning and the religious meaning. So literally it's saying, I love thee freely with the ability to make choices without prejudice. I choose this as men strive for moral right. But then the religious significance of right is the righteous one who's holy in heart. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. So we're looking at purely, which is pure, free from guilt or sin. And if we look at the religious connotation of praise, because we have a religious motif in this, we're talking about magnify and glorify. So just to emphasize this, Elizabeth's love is pure, God-given, and holy and blessed. Okay, that keeps happening because every time I unpause the video, it flips forward. So just ignore it. Okay. In lines 9 through 10, she is talking about her love, and it's not necessarily a positive connotation. We have, I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. So we have the word passion, which on the face of things, we think of passion today to be this really intense feeling, and that's not wrong, but it does derive from the Latin word meaning to suffer. And then she says, in my old griefs, meaning the griefs or grudges she's held in the past and she's still holding on to. She has that kind of intensity that lasts through the ages, but she's not comparing it to a positive experience. She's comparing it to a negative experience. And then also when we get to with my childhood's faith, my old griefs and my childhood's faith both reinforce the more negative to suffer connotations that come from passion rather than a more positive connotation. If you'll remember from earlier in the video, her childhood was not necessarily positive. She was sick from an early age. She had an authoritarian father, and this was not something she appreciated. Once she ran off and got married to Robert, he did disown her. This isn't the misguided authoritarian father that keeps all of his children and we love him anyway kind of type. This is the even at the time it was happening, she could understand that it was not it was wrong. That kind of attitude. Also, I have in my notes here that the Greek meaning of passion also stems from the word to suffer. So both in Latin and in Greek, we have passion means to suffer. And this can also relate to the religious motif again. Some of you may be familiar with the Passion of Christ. That's not a positive thing either. And if you're not familiar with that, you can just look that up and you'll see that's not as important to the rest of this poem, but there is still that religious motif. Her childhood's faith also is another biblical reference. Matthew 18, 2-4. Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So childlike faith, like her relationship to religion when she was younger, was trusting and passionate. And that, even though Elizabeth was religious in her old age, and she only lived to 55, so older age, she definitely had a less tainted view on religion. So she has this passion and intensity that has stood with her through the tests of time. And that is how she's describing her love for Robert. So complicated, multi-layered love for Robert. 11-12. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall love thee better. I shall but love thee better after death. So this is 11-14. I combined them all into one slide instead of what my notes say where I separated them. So, with my lost saints, with God, there's more of that religious motif. She also says, I love thee with breath. Breath represents life. You can't live without breathing. Smiles, tears, all of this. This poem traces all the stages of life. She loves him throughout life. That just keeps continuing that theme of I love you through everything. I love you no matter what. She is just mapping out how complete her love is for Robert.